Good evening. I want to say how pleased I am to be here in this wonderful setting at Elmhurst College, but the truth is I'm pleased to be anywhere where I get to finish a sentence without getting interrupted. I'm sure some of you do recognize me as typically the lone woman, the lone liberal, if I dare say, on the McLaughlin Group, which is a televised public affairs show, but it's really more like a televised food fight. It's the only show where you're expected to speak before you think, and interrupting each other, calling each other names, being generally rude is all considered part of good television today. The show is the creation of John McLaughlin, formerly Father John McLaughlin. He is a former Jesuit priest, and he taught in a prep school in Connecticut for many years before he went into politics. And he once told me that the best and the most memorable teachers are those who project themselves as characters. And I'm sure the students here and everybody else will agree that is the case. And I've met enough of his former students over the years to understand that what he does on television was transplanted right out of the classroom. He would arrive in his long robe with a velvet rope tied around the middle, a black Homburg hat, and white gloves. Every classroom had a beadle, B-E-A-D-L-E. It's an Anglican church term. It's the person who follows behind the bishop with the incense. In secular terms, it would be the hall monitor. And on the McLaughlin Group, it's Pat Buchanan. A lot of people think when John calls him the beadle, it's the bug, but no, it's beadle, and it's a church term. And in the classroom, John would then hand the Homburg to the beadle, and then with great flourish, remove the gloves one finger at a time. So he always created a show, and off camera, he is exactly like he is on camera. He is blustery, overbearing, full of moral certitude, and his nickname at the prep school was Father God. Babe Buchanan, who was Pat Buchanan's little sister, once said to me, "Eleanor, you don't know the half of it. The reason he dropped out of the priesthood was so that he could get rid of Father and just be known as God." He actually ran for political office. He ran for the U.S. Senate in Rhode Island in 1970 as a long-haired anti-war priest on the Republican ticket. And the local religious authorities did not approve. It was a time when the Vatican did not want members of the clergy to either run or hold public office. John's response to that was, you'd think Senator Kennedy, with his reputation, wouldn't mind having a priest nearby. He got 36% of the vote, I think it was, so the Republic was safe. But he came back to politics, and he got a job in the Nixon White House as a speechwriter, and he had special dispensation to live in the Watergate Hotel, which is fancy surroundings for someone who's taken a vow of poverty. But if you ask him about that period, he will point out the Vatican actually owns part of the Watergate, so it's really company housing. When Nixon resigned, John was among his last defenders. He spent a few weeks working in the Ford White House, and then he created a radio show, and it was a rambunctious radio show. And when I came to Washington in December of 1976 as a green reporter covering Carter campaign, I knew of John only as that crazy right-wing priest. And he took that crazy right-wing priest to television, and he started a show which was very different at the time. His idea was that you would get 5 people who would sit around, sort of like a men's locker room, and argue with each other, interrupt each other. As my late husband used to say, it was lots of towel snapping. It was not a show that women would feel naturally comfortable doing. And in fact, there weren't very many women. But he invited me on, and the first couple of times I was on the show, they were actually rather polite to me. They would occasionally let me speak, and then they simply would go back to what they were doing. It was like I was in a parallel universe. And it wasn't until Bob Novak, who's known affectionately in Washington as the Prince of Darkness, until he actually confronted me to my face, wagged his finger in my face, and said, "Eleanor Clift and people of her ilk." So I knew that if they were willing to insult me to my face, I was finally part of the crowd. And the show started out firmly on the right. John, of course, was a columnist for National Review, and Pat Buchanan was a conservative commentator who went on to run for president as both a Republican and on a reform ticket. And Bob Novak, of course, got a taste of fame recently for his role in the Valerie Plame CIA uncovering, and he is also firmly on the right. But this last 6 years of the Bush administration has taken its toll, and most notably with John McLaughlin. He was not supportive of the war initially, and frankly, neither was Pat Buchanan. He doesn't have that high regard for President Bush. His president was Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan actually had dinner at his house and appointed his first wife Secretary of Labor. John thinks that all the focus paid to the social issues like gay marriage and abortion rights is way overdone, and he and Pat Buchanan will have some spirited arguments about that off camera. Why has this shift occurred, particularly on the war? First of all, John didn't support the first Gulf War either. He is, after all, a former Jesuit priest. They don't like war in general. And then he comes out of, I think, the older Republican tradition of isolationism, which is what he shares that with Pat Buchanan. So he didn't like the idea of this imperialistic invasion. Thirdly, he's traveled to that part of the world. He spent a year ago, over the Easter break, he and his wife went to Tehran, and he came back just raving about how eager the younger generation, and they're practically all young in Iran, how interested they are in Western culture, and how the country was ready for reform, and we ought not to play into the conservatives' hands in that country. And so he has what I would call liberal attitudes on these issues. And as the war has dragged on, and not in a very good way, Tony Blankley is about the only member of the panel who is still supportive of the war. And Tony, for those of you who watch the show, is often my chief nemesis on the show. He was Newt Gingrich's former press secretary, and actually he was a great source. I liked it better as a source than I do as a combatant on the McLaughlin Group. But he's been very supportive on the war. But I think it was last week's show, I think there was a turning point. John was saying, there's no way that we're going to be able to win in Iraq. This is a culture. And he said they've been at each other's throats for 9,000 years. And Tony got all exercised. No, you're wrong, you're wrong. It's been 14,000 years. So I thought that was a significant admission. And it does give me my segue into the subject of tonight's talk, which is chiefly Iraq and the politics thereof. It's true, they have been at each other's throats for 14,000 years, but never to this extent. The sectarian violence has never been this extreme. And I think it's well to understand that these are three distinct cultures, ethnicities, tribal religions, however you want to term it. And Iraq was an artificial country to begin with. The boundaries were drawn by the British, by Winston Churchill, as part of a colonial exercise, post-colonial exercise. And the first ruler of Iraq was actually a Saudi king who was imported by the British. So these are tribal cultures who have traditionally been uneasy with each other, but they weren't killing each other. And the U.S. invasion has touched off this sectarian violence, and it has exaggerated the ethnic differences of these three cultures. And the Shiite majority, they are 60% of the population, and they spent decades being oppressed by the 20% Sunni minority under Saddam Hussein. And the Kurds in the north are perfectly comfortable. They've been autonomous now for a number of years, and they probably would eventually like their own state, which neighboring Turkey is resisting. But the Kurds, it is peaceful in the north. The chief problem is the battle between the Shiites and the Sunnis. The Sunnis not wanting to accept that they are indeed a minority, and the Shiites saying, okay, you said you're bringing democracy to the country. We're the dominant population here. Everything should be ours. And as we go into the 5th year of this war, anybody with any economic means has left the country. I read a particularly telling detail, I thought, said, don't get a toothache in Baghdad. There are no dentists left. And there are certainly more moving stories than that of infants born with a hole in the heart, which is very fixable, except there are no surgeons. And there is a handful of American surgeons now going in and performing these kinds of operations. But the society is really disrupted. And the Washington Post recently had a front-page story on what they call the Iraqi Diaspora. And they pointed out that 2 million Iraqis have now left the country. And they are destabilizing Jordan, which is our ally, and also Syria. There really aren't jobs for them, and there really aren't living accommodation for them as well. And they are leaving Iraq as best they can at the rate of 50,000 people a month. The New York Times occasionally runs these charts of measuring from the month in 2003, 2004, and comparing each month. And they have a number of categories. And one of them is electricity. And there are fewer hours of electricity per day now than there were when they were living under Saddam Hussein. And when the U.S. military went in early 2003, in March of 2003, with our shock and awe, and toppled the statue of Saddam, and were in Baghdad in a matter of days, they thought we were Supermen, and they can't understand why we can't even turn on the lights. So they figure it's part of some conspiracy, and that we're really there to take their oil. So we have lost the hearts and minds in Iraq, and that is key to winning any insurgency. And so I think that's what makes the situation that we face now especially problematical. I do see a lot of gray hair in the audience, and I must say this reminds me of a teach-in from the Vietnam era, where people who felt strongly about the war then got up and talked, and students came, and the country was very much engaged in the Vietnam War. We don't have that kind of intimate engagement today, I think chiefly because this is a war that's being fought by a volunteer army. It's fought by somebody else. Not everybody has the prospect of being drafted the way they were during the Vietnam era. So we don't have the level of engagement. Nonetheless, the country did change the Congress over this issue. And every poll that's taken shows that the Iraq War tops the list of concerns for the American people. And we right now have this looming confrontation between a president who's very much entrenched in his belief that he is doing the right thing and that he can't abandon the war at this point. And we have a Congress that is emboldened by the vote of, if not confidence, by the vote of hope that they got from the American people in November. And who wins this confrontation I have my my biases as to who I think will come out ahead. But if I try to put myself in the shoes of the people at each end of Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, I can see what the White House is doing. The President is looking back at 1995 when President Clinton was facing a newly emboldened Republican Congress, and Speaker of the Republican House, a gentleman named Newt Gingrich, had sent the White House, with Republican votes primarily, a budget that President Clinton didn't like. President Clinton vetoed it, and we had a similar standoff that we are about to face now with different players, but the same sort of stakes. And President Clinton was fighting for programs that were popular with the American people. And of course he framed it that you're not going to get your veterans benefits if the budget doesn't pass. The FBI isn't going to be fully staffed, and there's always the clincher, the Washington Monument will get shut down. And in fact, the Park Services did stop, Park Rangers stopped functioning. And Newt Gingrich thought that the American people would applaud his efforts to restrain spending, and that they would blame Bill Clinton for shutting down the government. Newt went on a plane ride with the President on an overseas trip, thinking that they would talk about this impasse on the trip. President Clinton spent the 17-hour flight, I think it was, playing hearts with reporters and didn't address Newt Gingrich on any of these serious issues. When they arrived back home at Andrews Air Force Base, to add insult to injury, Newt Gingrich was forced to deplane from the back of the plane along with the hoi polloi instead of the front of the plane with the dignitaries. And he was so ticked off that he went to a breakfast in Washington and complained that he'd been made to fly coach and hadn't been paid attention to. And the Daily News ran a front page headline calling Gingrich a crybaby, and they had a picture of him, a cartoon of him wearing a diaper. It was probably the low point of Gingrich's popularity, and in the face-off between the White House and the Republican Congress, Clinton won, and he won big. I think President Bush is assuming the American people are going to side with him, that he wants to protect the troops, keep funding the troops, and that Democrats are undermining the troops and trying to withdraw funds. The Democrats are gambling that the American people don't want to fund this war, and they will applaud efforts to try to restrain the president, and they will support the Democratic Congress. And everybody's on vacation this week. They're back home testing the waters in the district to see, if they're on the right path. And they will be back. The Congress will be back the week after next, and they're going to have to address this spending bill. So there have been a lot of theatrics already, and there will be more. The first thing that the Congress has to do, they have to reconcile what the House passed with what the Senate passed. The House wants a deadline, a binding deadline of combat troops brought home by September of '08. The Senate has a goal of beginning to bring home combat troops by March of '08. So the Democrats are going to have to resolve this among themselves, which is a tricky maneuver because in the House there are 80 members of the Get Out of Iraq caucus, and they are the most liberal members, and they say their bottom line is there has to be a hard and fast deadline for bringing home those troops. The Senate is not so sure, and they were not able to pass a binding deadline, and some of their most esteemed members when it comes to military matters oppose a hard deadline, particularly Senator James Webb of Virginia, whose victory in Virginia actually gave the Democrats control of the U.S. Senate. So there are some prominent people opposing it. And you've got John Murtha, probably you followed him. He's been in Congress forever, and he's a good friend of Nancy Pelosi, and he's seen it all, and he says, and I think I believe him, he says the Democrats will somehow they will agree on a bill and they will have it to the president by April 25th. Meanwhile, President Bush had a press conference early this week, and he says there's urgency here. The troops are going to be left without the proper equipment. And, Congress is being irresponsible. But the Congressional Budget Office says there's enough money for the troops through July. So there actually is enough time here to resolve this. And I think that the president, if he gets a bill that doesn't have a hard and fast deadline that says there's a goal of bringing the troops home, who could be opposed to a goal of bringing home the troops? So he may find a way to agree. So there are theatrics here on both sides. And the new dynamic is you have a Democratic Congress that is feeling its power. After 6 years of a supine Republican Congress that looked the other way when the White House did just about everything. They conducted no oversight. And New York Times columnist, former columnist Bill Sapphire said, not only was there no oversight, the Congress did undersight. I mean, they basically, looked the other way. And so you have Nancy Pelosi this week in the Middle East, in Syria, in defiance of the administration, saying that her visit to Syria is sending a mixed message. 3 Republicans were there just a few days before, and that didn't seem to bother the White House. But the fact that Pelosi went to Syria is, I think, it's a symbol of the new assertiveness on the Democratic side. The Democrats also passed a budget that did not extend the president's tax cuts. And I might add, this is the first war that we've had where there has not been a tax increase, where there have been tax cuts, and there has been no call for sacrifice. As I said earlier, it's a war that's fought by a volunteer army. It's an invisible war to much of America, and the White House has worked to keep pictures of returning coffins off the front pages. They don't allow photographs. And it's only occasionally that the war comes home, as it did when the Washington Post did their expose on the difficulties returning veterans were having. And there were hearings at Walter Reed Hospital, which is just a few miles from where I live in Washington. And I remember the wife of one of the wounded soldiers. She talked about how hard it was for her to get the disability benefits for her husband, who had suffered a traumatic brain injury. And the bureaucrats had gone back and looked at his high school transcript and determined that he had a learning disability in high school. So they said it was a pre-existing condition. And her line, which has stayed with me, was, "You all took him, didn't you?" And yeah, we all took him, we did. And so there is an obligation that comes from that. And another figure that struck me was that 44% of the casualties are coming from communities with an under 10,000 population. So a lot of the volunteers in our Army are coming from rural America. They are patriots, as we all are. They are patriots, but there's also an economic imperative into their joining the military. So when the Democrats took over in November, I think there was an expectation on the part of some that they would magically be able to end this war. And so I think it's important to understand that the Democrats, are in power, but just barely. They have 51-seat majority in the Senate. You have to subtract Senator Lieberman because he supports the Republicans on the war. You have to subtract Senator Johnson of South Dakota because he had a brain hemorrhage and he hasn't been back to the Senate to vote. So the 51 votes they cobbled for the war spending measure a week or so ago was done with 49 Democrats and then 2 Republicans. Only 2 Republicans joined. Senator Chuck Hagel, who may well be a presidential candidate because you see John McCain has tied himself very closely to Bush on the war. He's having trouble raising money. He really seems to be fading as a candidate. Senator Hagel would be an anomaly on the Republican side, an anti-war Republican. vote for the war, but he's been very outspoken ever since. And the other Republican that joined the Democrats was Senator Gordon Smith of Oregon, who was up for re-election in 2008. And I'm not questioning his sincerity, but he's also looking at the electorate and where he will be comfortable in 2008. So I meet a lot of Democrats who are impatient with their party. They think their party is spineless, that they haven't taken a stronger stand. And I think it's important to understand there's a difference between protesting a war and legislating a war. And the famous exchange, which was on YouTube, was David Obey, House member from, I think he's from Wisconsin, chairman of the Appropriations Committee, longtime member of Congress. He crafted the war spending bill on the House side. He voted against the war. He does not support the war. He put together a bill that includes lots of little additional things. Money for spinach growers, money for peanut farmers, money for security at the Republican and Democratic conventions, plus some very worthy additional spending for veterans, money for children's health insurance. And the bill has been ridiculed by President Bush, among others, as being laden with pork. This is how legislators do business. You can call it buying votes, and but you can also point out that if this president had funded the war through the traditional budget process, there would not be a need for an emergency spending bill. He's gotten all the money for the war through these extra bills. And extra bills have traditionally been used for drought relief, hurricane relief. So this is not something that's uncommon, what the Congress has done. But David Obey, who again crafted the bill, was accosted by an anti-war protester in the hallway of the House Office Building. This was a woman whose son was about to embark on his third deployment in Iraq, and she was furious at the Democrats for not doing a better job of ending the war. And Obey just exploded, and he said, you know, you don't understand how Congress works. We can only end this war by funding this war and tying the president's hands. And he used the phrase, idiot liberals. You idiot liberals think that we can just bring a war to an end immediately. Now, the use of language was counterproductive, as they say in Washington, but the man had a point. And the Democrats are also fighting history here in terms of who gets blamed for this war if it is seen as a defeat. The Vietnam analogy is often raised. The Democratic Congress cut off funds for the Vietnam War, but they didn't cut off those funds until there were no more American troops left on the battlefield in Vietnam. They cut off money to the South Vietnamese government. Nonetheless, the Democrats have spent 30 years with what you could call the Vietnam hangover, that we would have won in Vietnam if the Democrats had not cut off the money. And so, Democrats are wary of having the blame for this war shifted to them. And there is a suspicion in Washington that the real meaning of this surge of troops that the president has sent into Baghdad is really to make just enough progress to enable the architects of this war to blame any loss on the media and Democrats. They can say, we're just beginning to make progress with the surge, and now you want to pull the plug. And the military men will say justifiably that if you put a deadline for withdrawal, you put that out there, that is foolish from a military perspective. Why tell the enemy what you're going to do? You want to keep the enemy guessing. But monarchy, you have to make the political concessions to end the insurgency or to tamp down the insurgency. Now, I personally don't think the existing government, which is hunkered down in the green zone, is capable of making those concessions. But they are the government, and if they can't make the concessions, who does? And how long can we stay in the middle of what is really a civil war? My friend Tony Blankley would say this is an insurgency, and if we hang in there, we can defeat it. There is not a single example of a non-Muslim nation putting down an Islamic insurgency. The French didn't do it in Algiers, the Soviets didn't do it in Afghanistan, and there are more examples. And you have to look at the arithmetic of defeating an insurgency. The math is you need 20 soldiers per 1,000 people to achieve a minimum degree of stability. The ratio in Iraq is 6 soldiers per 1,000 people. So you would need over 500,000 troops in Iraq to have any hope of defeating this insurgency. And even then, I think it would be doubtful. And there is no way that we are capable as a country of having that significant increase in our troop level, either from the number of troops or from the point of view of public opinion. We can barely recruit the people now to maintain the presence that we have. And I know this is a college campus, and again, if there were a draft in play, there would be a lot of young people here. The draft really does insulate much of America from this war. There is a member of Congress, Charles Rangel, chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, congressman from Harlem with the gravelly voice, who has introduced a draft. I think he even voted against it himself when it came to the floor. He is making a point. A draft will not pass Congress in the foreseeable future because members of Congress think that that would be political suicide for them. And if there's one thing members of Congress are very good at, it's considering their own self-preservation. Plus the fact the military says they don't want a draft because people don't stay that long, and by the time you train them, they're happy with the volunteer army. The volunteer army is good, but we are taking advantage of them with repeated deployments and not giving them enough time at home and overusing the National Guard. And the point that Charlie Rangel wants to make about the draft, however, is that a draft would bring a war home across class and ethnic lines if everyone's son or daughter faced the prospect of being deployed in Iraq. So I think, is Congress micromanaging this war? I mean, I think Congress has not exercised its role in war making enough, and I think that the question here is not how long we're going to stay in Iraq. I think it's hard put to find anyone who thinks we can sustain this for more than 3 years. So the question is, how do we get out, and under what terms, and who gets blamed? And the Democrats don't want to run the risk of getting blamed for leaving Iraq, and President Bush doesn't want to leave Iraq before he leaves office because he doesn't want to be blamed for abandoning an effort that he started. And this is all playing out now in the 2008 presidential race. I mentioned earlier John McCain's difficulties because he is tied to the war. And on the Democratic side, Hillary Clinton is running a campaign that is oriented towards a general election. She's more hawkish than any of the other Democrats. She's a woman who could possibly be the first commander-in-chief. And her continued support of her initial vote that gave the president the right to go to war is either going to be the smartest decision she made, or it could cost her the primaries. And I really don't know how that's going to play out. But we're in for a fascinating general election campaign, a fascinating primary campaign. And I want to leave time here for questions, so I'm just going to point out that for those of you, I think, who are here, probably understand and love and follow politics, but a lot of young people today say politics is boring and what does it have to do with me? Politics is the best and the worst of human behavior. And I like to quote the late, great Molly Ivins, the Texas columnist, who died earlier this year. She often said, "You can't make this up," as she wrote about politics. And she said politics is the best free entertainment that the Western world has to offer. And that is true, and there is a kind of a game-like quality to it, but it's also very serious. And I can't think of a time in my life that the choices that we make over the next year will be more serious. And I can't think of a time in politics that has been as entertaining. So I think it's from both the seriousness part and the stylistic part. It's a great American race that we have to look forward to. So with that, I'd like to leave some time here for questions. I think Ron is going.
Not all night, but we have time.
Okay.
Eleanor Clift will take your questions. Yes, sir.
Yes, I would be interested in your observation about Nancy Pelosi going to Syria. I know what we hear in the press, but do you have any insights on the effectiveness and perhaps her motivation?
Well, I think he's asking about Nancy Pelosi going to Syria, any insights in her motivation. First of all, she's not the first legislator to go there, and she's following through on the recommendations of the Iraq Study Group, which have basically encouraged the opening up of a dialogue. So I think she's really in good company here. It's the Bush administration that is isolated. Even on the Republican side, the candidates who are running, they're all for talking. It makes no sense to not talk to somebody. This notion that the Syrians or the Iranians will somehow be rewarded just if we talk to them. It's bizarre, and the way the British handled the confrontation over the capture of their 15 sailors is a classic example of how you can achieve something by diplomacy. Now, imagine if they had been our 15 sailors and how Bush would have handled it. It's scary. He even introduced the word hostage in, which the British were very careful not to use. The president used that casually over the weekend. If these were our sailors, I think Bush would have been out there with lots of bombastic rhetoric. Instead, this ended with the British asking for direct talks with Iran, which I can't imagine Bush doing. He would see that as groveling or something. 15 sailors are home. Iran and Britain actually have a relationship, and I think we're going to come to an end of this Bush era. Even all the Republican candidates are advocating more talking, more diplomatic engagement. I think there's a recognition. Henry Kissinger just gave an interview, I think, to a British outlet, saying there is no military solution in Iraq. We are not going to impose a solution on this country. We have to get the countries in the region engaged. They may not be our allies, but it's not in their interest to have Iraq in chaos, and they have to deal with the refugees and all of that. So, there are no permanent allies, but there are permanent interests, and I think that's what you have to do. And I think Nancy Pelosi is signaling that Congress is a co-equal branch of government, and they're not going to lie down for a president whose approval rating is 33%.
Thank you.
Question right here.
Yes. Thank you for all the interruptions and stuff that you had to put up with all those years. Your voice kind of, soaring through the muddle of the male voices. Preemptive war, that's an issue that's never discussed. I mean, they said whether Saddam had weapons of mass destruction or not. To me, preemptive war is an immoral choice for any country. And John McLaughlin and all the other people who claim to be Christian, have strong Christian background, Christ said in the Sermon on the Mount,
Can I ask you, what's your
Can
question
I,
again?
can
sir?
can I speak before you interrupt? He said on the Sermon
Just
on the
follow
Mount.
the lead.
He said on the Sermon on the Mount, when your enemy strikes, you must turn the other cheek. Now, that preemptive war is an antichrist doctrine.
Well, John McLaughlin has done that particular issue on whether this is a just and moral war, and he says it isn't. And he does come at it from a religious angle. So, I mean,
I've never heard anyone quote Christ.
Well, I don't know that he specifically quotes Christ, but he does, yeah, he
Well,
does.
what is your position on preemptive war?
Well, so McLaughlin doesn't think it's a just war. My position on preemptive war, it was an unstated part of American policy. If any American president thought there was a grave and immediate threat, and they were about to launch a bomb, there would be a preemptive strike. But it has never been put into policy terms the way this president did, and it's never been launched on such faulty evidence. And it's Vice President Cheney is one of the prime movers here, and there's an excellent book written called The 1% Doctrine, which follows from what Dick Cheney has said. If there's a 1% chance that an enemy could give a nuclear weapon to a terrorist, then he's going to take preemptive action. And they built this whole house of cards on the notion that Saddam Hussein, one, was on the verge or indeed had weapons of mass destruction, and that he was going to share them with al-Qaeda, when there was really no evidence to support either of those notions. And there was contrary evidence. The CIA basically said Saddam Hussein is no friend of terrorists. There's no al-Qaeda connection. He ran a repressive regime, but he didn't house and encourage terrorists. And the only reason he would use nuclear weapons is if he were cornered, which we then proceeded to corner him. And we also chose to not believe the weapons inspectors sent by the UN who were in Iraq, who said there were no weapons of mass destruction. The Bush administration felt they were in cahoots with the Saddam Hussein regime. This is all, it's been gone over in a number of excellent books. There will be many more books, and the historians will look at this at this period. But what I think happened, I think the Bush administration came in feeling there was a job undone, that Saddam Hussein had been left in power. You get into the edible thing, the son wants to outdo the father. Then you have 9/11 happen, and bombing Afghanistan, which is a country that is little more than rubble to begin with, was not very satisfying. And they thought they could bomb Iraq and have this show of American power, and it would signal the world, don't mess with America, don't mess with Texas. And their rationale was that Bill Clinton, in his 8 years in office, had responded to various terrorist strikes with these little pinprick cruise missile strikes, and that we had showed weakness. So, I mean, I give them, I understand their reasoning, and they thought they were doing the right thing. The problem is that the show of American strength only radicalized our enemies, and it also showed how difficult it is for a modern military machine to fight suicide bombers. And now we're in an occupation of an oil-rich Muslim country. And the optics, as they say, are not good.
Well, first I'd like to say that I'm very proud of my department for bringing some reality to the campus. I'm giving us credit. It's good.
Okay.
My question is, how would you rate the performance of the American media in the days leading up to the Bush invasion of Iraq? And what could be done by the media to obstruct the obvious rush to war with Iran so we don't repeat the same mistake?
The media did not do its job in the run-up to the war with Iraq, and I've tried to figure that out. But after Watergate, which was a trauma to the American political system, the press got not just skeptical, very cynical about the American government, and they didn't believe anything that anybody in power said. After 9/11, which was an attack on media centers in New York and Washington, it was as though all skepticism was suspended, and everything that the Bush administration said was taken at face value. And even the comments about the trade towers and the possibility that people could get ill from what they were breathing. I mean, now you see people being sickened in lawsuits. But all of that was just sort of ignored in this, suddenly the media, we were covering a war president, we were writing about military maneuvers, and it all seemed terribly important, and it all seemed very bright. Now, under the surface, there were a lot of doubts on Capitol Hill. If that had been a secret vote to go to war, I don't believe it would have passed. I think a lot of people were afraid of the sort of superheated patriotism that was in the air, and Democrats in particular were told, you vote against this war, they find weapons of mass destruction, you are dead politically. And so you've had the political candidates, or people with political presidential ambition, vote against it. Now, almost half the Senate Democrats voted against the resolution, and more than half the House Democrats. But it was, members of Congress are not profiles in courage, and so there were political considerations definitely came into play. And the White House played they played hardball. I mean, remember Ari Fleischer, the press secretary, saying you better watch what you say, and Bill Maher, who said you can call the terrorists lots of things, but you can't say they weren't courageous, flying planes into buildings. He lost his show. So you have to remember what the country was like at that period. Now, in terms of manufacturing a reason to go to war with Iran, I think this incident with the British slows down any effort like that, because it shows, one, that Ahmadinejad, for all his craziness, is not fully in control. I mean, it's a very divided government over there. Diplomacy can work, and Bush doesn't have the wherewithal to go to another country and start war. He doesn't have an army. He has a navy, and that's why people are nervous that the carrier fleets are there, and they put a Navy admiral suddenly in charge of Iraq. What's that about? And I'm still not fully confident that before this president leaves office, he may try to do something. For two reasons. One, he believes that what he did in Iraq is the right thing to do. He continues to believe that. And secondly, he thinks whoever follows him won't have the nerve to take on Iran. But anybody who looks at that situation, even if you did bomb, whatever they have, they've been smart enough to disperse it. You couldn't get it all. You would embolden the population. You would nationalize the population. It's just like Iraq. I mean, they didn't hate us to begin with, but they hate an occupying army, and you bring out all these nationalistic impulses. So I think there's a fair chance that Bush will get out of town before he does further damage.
Sir.
I just had a question regarding the media run up to the Iraq War in 2003 State of the Union address. This was statement of the Nigerian Yellow Pig, which President Bush, before he gave that speech, was strongly advised not to mention it because it was not true. It was blasphemy. How important, in your opinion, in that single statement, how much weight did that contribute to the Congress moving the war and American support?
Well, that particular piece of evidence about the yellow cake, how much that influenced the White House, I think that was one of several pieces. I would look more at what Colin Powell's appearance before the United Nations, and I don't think he even used that, but he had photos of these mobile labs that supposedly were transporting things, and they depended a lot on information that came from a source whose name within the intelligence community was called Curveball. That tells you something. And he's been discredited. And then you had Ahmed Chalabi, who was a exiled Iraqi. Then I think he was on trial for embezzlement in Jordan or something. And he was the one who was feeding the New York Times plus the State Department in this nice little closed loop about the likelihood of weapons of mass destruction. So the sources that they relied on were really highly suspect. The thing is, they wanted to find reason to go to war. And they couldn't say, we want to do this because we think that Iraq will be easy to take, and it looked that way at the beginning. We could just take off the head of the regime, topple Saddam Hussein, will plant democracy in the Middle East, we will transform the region, peace in the Middle East will be through Baghdad as opposed to Jerusalem. And that was their plan, and they never had a plan B. And it's incredibly naive when you look back on it. And there were people who were warning that this was not the case. But then you get into Bush's style of leadership. He's got his MBA from Harvard Business School. He thinks of himself as a CEO. He surrounds himself with a small, tight circle of trusted allies. He equates dissent with disloyalty. Disagreement, he looks at people who are as whiners. They're raising these problems, they're just whining. He does not have a curious mind. He does not seek out outside advice. And so he's very isolated. And I think he sincerely believed that they could carry this off. And initially it looked wonderful. They were in Baghdad very fast, and he was strutting around on the carrier with mission accomplished. And then when the insurgency started up, it took them a long time to even admit there was an insurgency or a guerrilla war. And the looting at first, remember, and there's so many lines here. Rumsfeld saying stuff happens, saying it's the same guy with the same vase, and the media just keeps showing it over and over. The looting was profound. I mean, they took everything that wasn't nailed down, and the fact that we couldn't bring law and order from the very beginning, set the tone. And you don't get to make a first impression. And the first impression of the U.S. military after the initial conquest of Baghdad was really pretty sorry. And I'm the co-chair of a group called the International Women's Media Foundation, and we have an Iraqi journalist with us as a fellow. And I actually said to her, I said, do you hate America? She said, I hate your government, and I hate your military. She said, I didn't hate the military right away, but after Abu Ghraib, and after too many innocent people were gone, I hated your military. She said, but if you came to Iraq, I would welcome you. And she's now studying in Boston, and she's loving the American people and the culture. And she described going into a supermarket, and when the checkout guy asked her where she was from, and he saw she had an accent, and she said she's kind of reluctant to say Iraq, and he said, oh, cool. And that's the response she's getting. But she thinks the Americans should just leave and let them sort it out. But she happens to be Shiite, and the Shiites would like us to leave because they think they will just run things. And we're now in this odd position of defending the Sunnis, who were our enemy under Saddam Hussein. And how long we can continue to do that, I don't know.
As you mentioned before, there's a problem of apathy among young people.
Louder.
Sorry. There's a problem of apathy among young people, especially concerning politics. And you mentioned in Vietnam era, there was the threat of the draft to motivate young people. Can we be motivated now, and if so, how?
Wow, I think young people want to answer that question more than me. But what motivates people is self-interest. How about some of the students, how about some of the candidates get out there, instead of talking about Social Security, they really made an issue about student loans. And I think, candidates don't really respond to young people, although I think that's going to be different this time. I think Barack Obama has tapped into a vein of idealism in the country. And whether he can carry that to the next step and really develop a sense of, gravitas and policies and all that, is still a question. But when you look at the crowds that he gets, I think it's promising. And Howard Dean, who's the Democratic Party chairman, said to me, he has a son who's 20, and he said, my son hates politics, hates politicians, he said, including his father. What did he want for Christmas? He wanted Barack Obama's books, and he said he would walk over broken glass to hear Barack Obama. So whatever happens to Obama, whether he succeeds or not, it almost doesn't matter if he can create some excitement around politics. And John McCain did that in 2000. I think John McCain has lost that sort of maverick appeal now. But the gap between the rich and the poor, globalization and jobs and all that is very much affects young people and your future. And I think, you know, it's up to the politicians to sort of make that connection so the young people will respond. So I don't blame the people. I mean, I think it is it's the challenge of leadership to make things interesting enough that people will pay attention to them.
There's time for one more question. Do you think, did the Congress abdicate their responsibility, the constitutional responsibility to declare war? Would there have been a difference?
Congress does have the constitutional responsibility to declare war. They've kind of avoided that. The Korean War was never officially declared a war. I think it was a police action. The president took the vote in October of 2002 as the equivalent vote of a war resolution. And you know, depending on how Iraq goes, you do see some senators, notably Senator Biden, talking about having another resolution that basically says the president cannot go engage in a military action in Iran without coming to Congress first. And they are talking about rewriting the original 2002 resolution because that talked about weapons of mass destruction and it talked about issues that no longer exist. So there is sort of toing and froing around the constitutional margins here. But I think in the end, if this president insists on prosecuting this war at the level it is, the Democrats would have to simply not send him a supplemental bill. Just if he vetoes what they send him, they could just not send him anything. And that really would abruptly cut off the funding. That would be high risk politically, and I don't know that the Democrats would be willing to do that. Again, especially with the surge in operation, because the surge does create some, I think, false sense that maybe there is victory here down the road somewhere. And the Democrats, it would be very perilous if they cut off funding completely. So it's a back and forth that is very difficult to predict how exactly it's going to come out. But I applaud everything Congress is doing to get in the game here, because I think this president has taken too much unilateral action upon himself.
Thank you all. Well, you'll have time to talk to her again if you want to get a book signing or chat with her. Before we leave, I'd like to invite my colleague, Dr. Anne Frank Wake.
Come bearing gifts.